I'm Terence McKenna. From the beginning of Vladimir Putin's 2022 invasion of Ukraine, our team at The National has been closely monitoring the Russian president's speeches and watching how that message has been reflected on Russian propaganda TV channels.
Зачем НАТО расширялось на восток? Чтобы нас уничтожить.
Now you would always have the same line. This war is forever. Don't expect it to end any point.
We've traced his multiple threats of nuclear war.
Для защиты России и нашего народа мы, безусловно, используем все имеющиеся в нашем распоряжении средства. Это не блеф.
I'm not bluffing, he said it.
Well, he wouldn't say I am bluffing, would he?
And we have had a close-up look at his trusted advisors, all to find an answer to the central question. What is Putin's endgame?
Putin so far has shown himself scared stiff of acknowledging defeat because he doesn't want the reckoning.
Федерации Владимир Владимирович Путин.
4 years before his invasion of Ukraine, Vladimir Putin famously bragged that if he wanted to, his army could take the capital, Kyiv, in a matter of weeks or even days. That assertion was repeated endlessly on Russian propaganda TV channels.
Понимали, что в горячей войне мы Украину победим за 2 дня.
И Киев будет взят так быстро? 1,5-3 дня.
2 дня, а потом падение города.
When the Russians finally invaded last February, soldiers in the invasion force were indeed assured that they would only be in Ukraine for a couple of days. Things didn't quite turn out that way. The Russian tanks were stopped in their tracks before reaching Kyiv. And the war has dragged on for over a year. That has required a change in the message from the Russian propaganda channels, especially from Putin's most loyal supporters, Vladimir Solovyov and RT channel head Margarita Simonyan.
И мы воюем вот с этой сволочью. Местные нацисты всегда нацисты.
Специальной военной операции.
In the early days of the invasion, viewers were told the army was going to wipe out a small band of Nazis that were controlling the Ukraine government.
Потому что в них этот нацизм сидит, как герпес.
Now, to justify why the war is taking longer, the TV channels explain that Russia is fighting not a small band of Ukrainian Nazis, but the NATO alliance and the entire Western world.
Мы никак не можем понять, что это война, в которой ставится цель уничтожения нас. Зачем НАТО расширялось на восток? Да чтобы нас уничтожить.
Мы воюем с НАТО. Это не Украина, это НАТО. Это все их мощности, которые сейчас против нас.
As always, the TV channels are magnifying the themes established by Vladimir Putin himself.
НАТО осуществляет разведку по всему югу России. В Вашингтоне, Лондоне, Брюсселе прямо подталкивают Киев к переносу военных действий на нашу территорию.
Luke Harding was the Russia correspondent for the Guardian newspaper and has now written a book called Invasion about the war in Ukraine.
Propaganda works. We seem to have forgotten that. We seem to think that propaganda is something from the 20th century. Actually now, propaganda is more sophisticated, more multifarious, more kind of micro-focused than it's ever been. And Putin controls TV, which is, and has done for a long time, which is the main source of information for Russians. They are told they're fighting valiantly, not against Ukraine, but against NATO, against black American snipers, against evil Canadians. And people believe it. They believe it.
Airport. To see how the Putin message is playing in the poorer rural areas of Russia, which are overrepresented in the armed forces, we once again turn to Daniel Orion of the 1420 YouTube channel that does street interviews with ordinary Russians. A few months ago, we saw him in Moscow.
Я не буду отвечать на этот вопрос.
This time he went to Yadrin, a village 600 kilometers east of the capital, where support for Putin is strong.
Look at this. This is the whole street. I grew up right here, you see.
You just need to turn on TV and you will get it. You will see what they have in their minds.
Путин правильно поступает.
Поддержите, да?
Да, поддерживаю.
Надо Киев захватить тоже полностью. Всю Украину, чтобы наша была. Не Украина, а Россия.
Страна турков. Сейчас меня посадят, заберут. Забирайтесь к вами. Я уже старый человек. В общем, мы недовольны властью.
Some lady said, we are dissatisfied with the authorities. But she definitely didn't mean that she dissatisfied with Putin. They think that it's governors, it's someone else, but Putin is like a king. People in Great Britain, they will never say that king is to blame for everything. They will say it's prime minister, it's something like this, and it feels like here the same. Putin and every other can be blamed, but Putin is not to blame.
Dissident Russian sociologist Greg Uden, now visiting Princeton University in the US, says the lack of a quick victory in Ukraine changed the propaganda message.
And now you would always have the same line. This war is forever. Don't expect it to end at any point. This is forever. They want us to disappear. They want us to perish. And this war will continue forever until we break the back of the West, until the West is soundly, completely defeated.
Uden says the truth is what Putin made clear at the war's outset, that he wants to destroy Ukraine.
This is a genocidal war. This is framed by Putin as a genocidal war, because Putin says it quite openly, they don't exist. And for that reason, I think they are determined to push it right to the end.
Это сами знаете, войны. Нехуй их торопить. Нужно будет прыгнуть так, то мало не покажется. Понял?
Putin's announced partial mobilization of 300,000 military-aged Russians has led to an exodus of more than 300,000 young men who were desperate to escape military service.
И никто особо нигде никого не ждет, денежки закончатся, придется возвращаться.
Visitors with mobilization questions were not always welcome in the rural areas.
Вот как вы думаете, зачем их туда отправляют?
Куда зачем? Родину защищать.
Защищать.
Вы что еще думаете? Вы что, сторонник английской разведки, что ли, тут сведения собираете?
Нет.
Идите сами. Сколько вам лет?
Ну, скоро меня тоже призовут.
Вот и все, идите с чистой совестью. Тут ерундой занимаетесь. Разбить вас с этой аппаратурой вместе с английской разведкой.
Все.
Бессовестные.
Великую Отечественную войну защищали, выдержали 5 лет. А сейчас бегут, как эти псы.
И прямой обман.
One of the Putin themes that sells especially well in rural Russia is his hatred and contempt for gay people and the entire LGBTQ community.
Разве мы хотим, чтобы в наших школах с начальных классов детям навязывали извращения, которые ведут к деградации и вымиранию?
Во всем мире существует самец и самка. По-моему, здесь...
То есть...
Зачем это против природы идти?
Но это не по-человечески, не по-христиански.
Yeah, people say that they will kill LGBT people, definitely.
А вот если бы у вас, допустим, красная кнопка была, вот такая вот красная большая кнопка, вот вы бы нажали и...
Нажал бы.
Наверное.
В Нагорной проповеди Иисус Христос, обличая лжепророков, говорит:
Putin has lately taken to citing Jesus Christ to support his arguments, and is even portraying himself as a kind of Messiah, quoting the words of a radical Russian national.
Я верю в духовные силы русского народа. Его дух – мой дух. Его судьба – моя судьба.
Naturally, if he is a kind of Messiah, then in confronting the West, he must be fighting Satan.
Откровенного сатанизма. Начавшийся слом западной гегемонии необратим.
Satan is basically the definition of evil. This, I think, shouldn't be underestimated because they are now presenting this war as an existential war. I mean, you cannot, for instance, you cannot negotiate with Satan. You cannot set a peace agreement with Satan. You cannot even set a ceasefire with Satan. So if it's a radical evil, it has to be exterminated.
Потому что воюем не с этой бандеровской сволочью и педиками в его управлении, а воюем со всей сатанинской машиной Запада.
На Путина не надо всех собак вешать. Вешать надо на сатанистов из Вашингтона. Все от них пришло, все.
In Russia, the letter Z has come to represent support for Putin's war in Ukraine. In Moscow, it is plastered in the subway and around the city. It was even featured prominently in Christmas decorations. All this seems designed to reinforce the regime's message that this war is now part of everyday life, and it has only just begun. When we come back, the mysterious figure called Putin's chef and his vicious private army.
Все получают компенсации за потерю ноги, потерю руки, колостому и так далее.
Meet Evgeny Prigozhin, the latest star of the Russian war effort in Ukraine. Here he's making a recruitment video for his supposedly private army, the Wagner Group, which has its own exclusive supply of weapons and its own graveyard.
Погибшие парни, их номера и ордена, которые они имеют.
Это все Вагнер, да?
Это все чувака Вагнер, да.
He has a preoccupation with the glory of dying for Mother Russia.
Vladimir, how are you?
Prigozhin first appeared on the scene back in 2006 when President George W. Bush and his wife Laura visited Vladimir Putin and his then wife in St. Petersburg. In the background of an intimate dinner, there was Prigozhin, who became known as Putin's chef. In the years since, Prigozhin became a featured performer at Putin birthday parties and government dinners. Eventually, he was awarded massive contracts to provide food for government events, school lunch programs, and for the army. He became very rich. Prigozhin came to the attention of U.S. authorities when he started a side business called the Internet Research Agency that was involved with computer hacking. And he was soon indicted by the U.S. Federal Bureau of Investigation for the company's documented attempts to interfere with U.S. federal elections. Prigozhin at first denied that he had anything to do with the internet company, but recently admitted that he started it and that he was proud of his attempts to influence U.S. elections. He similarly at first denied any connection to the much bigger Wagner Group company, but eventually he also admitted his ownership of that.
I would not underestimate Prigozhin. There's a kind of criminal energy about him. There's a ruthlessness about him. And there's also a kind of PR, media flair about him that makes him a very dangerous opponent indeed.
Now Prigozhin is playing a key role in the Ukraine war. He appears in videos from the front lines and claims his Wagner forces are solely responsible for recent battlefield successes there. In a bizarre power struggle, he frequently denounces the generals in charge of the regular Russian army as ineffectual cowards.
He's very close to Vladimir Putin, and in a way he's kind of the president that Putin thinks he is, but isn't. I mean, Putin spends his time in the bunker. Prigozhin spends his time on the front line.
Prigozhin's clandestine activities began in Africa, where his Wagner Group mercenaries supported local dictators by eliminating their enemies. There were multiple human rights abuses catalogued by the Hodorkovsky Dossier Center in London, where this Russian investigator prefers to remain anonymous because the Wagner Group has been known to kill undesirable journalists.
Once a host country opens doors for them, they quite quickly become a power that can do pretty much whatever they want. And that ends up to a really huge harm to the local population because we're talking about rape, we're talking about murders.
Does the Wagner Group want the reputation of being more brutal?
Of course they do. That's a perfect reputation for quite bloody guys.
In Ukraine, the Wagner Group enhanced their reputation for brutality by raping women, torturing men during interrogations, and even burning them alive in front of their families. Then in September, this video was released of Prigozhin in a Russian prison yard, recruiting inmates, including murderers and rapists, to become soldiers in his private army.
Минимальный возраст, который мы берем, возраст, это 22 года. Если моложе, бумажник, от ближайших родственников они не против. Максимальный возраст, словно, это...
Prigozhin was comfortable in this setting. He himself had spent 9 years in prison in the 1980s for fraud and robbery. The inmates were offered freedom for a few months of fighting in Ukraine, but were told that there would be no surrender tolerated. One Wagner defector confirmed that retreat or surrender was not permitted.
Мне известно достоверно о 3 расстрелах заключенных, именно которые пытались совершить попытку побега с госпиталя. Ну, показательно. Вот предатели, вот отказники, вот смотрите, что может быть.
The Wagner forces in Ukraine more than quadrupled in size with the added forces and have been able to claim some victories in eastern Ukraine. This month, Prigozhin bragged that his troops were winning in the house-to-house fighting around Bakhmut.
Зажали подразделения противника, отказывались, те, кто отказывались сдаваться в плен, тех уничтожали.
In this bizarre video, he seemed to brag about the number of soldiers who died under his command, standing beside a pile of bodies and bags.
Получат оценки, повезут домой, которые погибли героически.
Dissident Russian journalist Mark Krotov of Radio Free Europe has closely tracked the activities of the Wagner Group in Ukraine, where he says their troops are clearly treated like cannon fodder on the battlefield.
We see dozens of dead bodies lying. We see dozens of shells craters, and if we look closely, we can see the part of the body. So I think somebody counted like 60 people here, and that's their typical tactics. That's Wagner's cannon fodder.
What's the purpose of that? What do they gain from that?
They make Ukraine to waste expensive ammunition first. They make Ukrainians to reveal their fighting position, their firing positions. They don't care about people, but they care about revealing and exhausting Ukrainian army because they have a lot of people, they can rotate them.
Prigozhin has viciously attacked both former Chief of Staff Valery Gerasimov on the left, who has recently been put in charge of all Russian forces in Ukraine, and Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu.
No one expects that Putin will do something with Prigozhin because Surovikin or because Shoigu is not happy with him. It's how he manages the thing for the last few decades.
So Putin
the balance
plays
of power.
one off the other.
Yes. He plays one versus other, and he never allows anyone to rise too high.
This Prigozhin photo op was in some just captured salt mines under Soledar in eastern Ukraine.
But I think we've now moved into a new phase where Prigozhin is playing a game. He's playing a very high-level game. There's a sort of power struggle of sorts going on between the Russian general staff of the armed forces and Prigozhin and Wagner. And what Prigozhin is saying, including by the recent capture of Soledar, is that my guys are more effective, more ruthless, more efficient than you are, therefore I should be given more control of this war. It's a power play, and I think it's quite a successful power play.
I think the thing Prigozhin wants most of all is a real political power, to become a political figure, because he knows that when you become high-ranked political figure, if you succeed your competitors, if you manage to survive, then you can convert this power into much more money than he can gain now.
We are talking about mafia state, if I may, okay? Law is out. Law is these Kremlin people. They decide what to do with you. Does it mean that Prigozhin at some point can be disposed? Yes, it does, absolutely. When he's not going to be needed, he might have the same fate, or either go to jail or be, executed.
The Wagner Group recruited over 40,000 convicts to serve in the front lines in Ukraine. A Russian human rights organization said that 3/4 of those were killed or wounded, deserted or surrendered. The growing body count doesn't seem to faze Vladimir Putin, as long as Prigozhin can claim some advances in eastern Ukraine. When we come back, should the world take Putin's nuclear threats seriously? Last February, on the third day of Vladimir Putin's attack against Ukraine, he went on television with his top generals and made a point of ordering them to place Russia's special nuclear forces on high alert. He has kept a drumbeat of nuclear threats in the months since. In December 2022, Russia released a video that suggested that nuclear missiles were being moved into position where they could be used in the Ukraine conflict. Putin often refers to the U.S. nuclear bombs dropped on Japan in 1945, and his message is clear. If the Americans can do it, then so can I.
США единственная страна в мире, дважды применившая ядерное оружие, уничтожив японские города Хиросиму и Нагасаки. Кстати говоря, создали прецедент.
Of course, nuclear bombs have become hundreds of times more powerful than those dropped on Japan and could literally destroy the world. But Putin seems to have thought of that too. He gave this absolutely chilling interview back in 2018.
Для мира будет глобальная катастрофа. Но я все-таки как гражданин России и глава российского государства, тогда хочу задаться вопросом, а зачем нам такой мир, если там не будет России?
A few months later, he even sounded like some sort of religious suicide bomber.
И, ну что ж, а мы жертвы агрессии. И мы как мученики попадем в рай. А они просто сдохнут. Потому что они даже раскаяться не успеют.
Dissident Russian sociologist Greg Utin thinks that Vladimir Putin is capable of using nuclear weapons.
As a last resort, there's no doubt for me that he is prepared to do that once he feels that he runs out of resources. Because once again, this is an existential situation for him. If he loses, he's dead. This is how he sees this situation.
Для защиты России и нашего народа мы, безусловно, используем все имеющиеся в нашем распоряжении средства. Это не блеф.
Putin saying he's not bluffing. I'm not bluffing, he said.
Well, he wouldn't say I am bluffing, would he?
British nuclear physicist Patricia Lewis is one of the world's foremost experts on nuclear weapons.
Just having made that threat does mean we have to take it seriously. If it were a bomb that were detonated in Ukraine, countries in the surrounding areas, people in the surrounding towns and cities in Ukraine would be told to stay indoors. There would be panic, that's absolutely true. The other thing to be aware of course, is that once you've used nuclear weapons on a battlefield, what you've done to that battlefield is made it uninhabitable for a very long time. And governments are thinking that through, there's no doubt about that. But they have for a long time. That was the scenario during the Cold War.
Chinese President Xi Jinping answered the Putin threats with a firm statement that the international community must jointly oppose the use of, or threats to use, nuclear weapons. In October, Putin tried to pull back a bit, saying he saw no reason to use nuclear weapons against Ukraine. But in December, he went back to his veiled threats.
Slava Ukraina! Slava Ukraina!
Bob Seeley was a British soldier who has become a Conservative member of Parliament and head of the Ukraine Working Group. He thinks the biggest downside of using a nuclear weapon for Putin is political.
Becomes even more isolated and the Chinese abandon him. I mean, I think that's the danger. That I think it's not so much what the West will do, but it's what China will do. It's what non-aligned countries will do. That effectively, if he does use nuclear weapons, he will simply become a larger version of North Korea. and I think it will be a disaster for the Russian state for a generation. I also then think he probably increases his chances of being ousted in a palace coup of some kind.
The general consensus seems to be that if Putin used a nuclear weapon in Ukraine, it would more likely be one of the smaller battlefield nukes that both the US and Russia tested in the 1950s, and not in the decades since.
A nuclear weapon of any size is a huge step change from a conventional weapon. That you get all sorts of problems with high winds, high wind velocity, a sucking up of dirt, which creates this sort of mushroom cloud effect. But also you get a prompt radiation, which goes out and affects all life forms in the area, plus enormous heat, which causes fires. The risk that there would be fallout that would spread to NATO countries, in which case it could be interpreted as an attack on NATO countries. That is possible. And he needs to take that into account.
I don't think we would respond with a nuclear weapon to their use of a nuclear weapon in Ukraine.
William Taylor served as the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine in the years leading up to the February Russian invasion. He points to the statement on this issue from U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan.
And we have communicated directly, privately, to the Russians at very high levels that there will be catastrophic consequences for Russia if they use nuclear weapons in Ukraine.
I am sure that in his private conversations, in his conversation directly with Russian leaders in the Kremlin, right around Putin, he was more explicit than catastrophic. And he said what it was, what those catastrophic consequences would be. And my bet is, I don't know this, but my bet is those catastrophic consequences would be a conventional attack from the United States and NATO on Russian military targets.
In the days leading up to the February invasion, apparently Putin delivered an odd message to then UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson.
He threatened me at one point and said, Boris, I don't want to hurt you, but with a missile it would only take a minute or something like that, Jolly.
Former U.S. National Security Advisor John Bolton has suggested that the private U.S. warning to Vladimir Putin should be more dire.
I think NATO should be thinking of what's the maximum deterrent message they could send to Putin, and my suggestion would be a very clear public statement that if Russia uses any nuclear device, Putin has signed his own death warrant.
Is that a realistic threat?
I think it is realistic, and I think if you can think of a stronger deterrent than telling Putin he's going to commit suicide if he does it, I'd be happy to consider that.
British MP Bob Seeley thinks threatening Putin with death would be unwise.
I'm not quite sure how you say that. What does that mean, that you'd flatten Moscow? It's pretty dangerous stuff, isn't it?
John Bolton says the U.S. could target Putin alone.
Well, I wouldn't discuss what we would do, but I have confidence we could do it.
He's someone who's deeply conspiratorial, and I think all he cares about, really, is his personal survival and power. And I think his fear is that were he to use a tactical nuclear weapon on Ukraine, the Americans would respond by dropping a bomb on his head. Now, I don't think that's a realistic scenario, but strangely, so long as Putin thinks that that may be the case, I think that is deterring him from using nuclear weapons, because the reality is America and NATO are vastly more powerful than Russia and could, if they wished, destroy Russia in pretty quick order.
The Americans who doubt Putin would use a nuclear weapon come back to that famous moment last February when Putin publicly ordered his generals to place Russia's nuclear forces on alert.
He didn't put them on alert. Our folks, we talked about the CIA, our intelligence agencies have no higher priority than to keep track of nuclear weapons in Russia. They watch it they know where they are, and they know what it takes to put them on alert, and it didn't happen. It didn't happen. It was saber rattling as a bluff. It was a bluff.
Sometimes this question comes down to an assessment as to whether Putin has become mentally unbalanced enough to use a nuclear weapon. Again, former U.S. National Security Advisor John Bolton thinks not.
But I've met with him on a number of occasions. I don't see that there's a mental issue here. In conversations I've had with him, and he does speak English, but where we've reached disagreement on something like arms control, he has said, well, you have your logic, we have our logic, we'll see which one prevails.
While most experts doubt Putin would use a nuclear weapon, many have lingering doubts they might be wrong. Most experts thought he would not invade Ukraine, and he did. Many believe he would only use nukes if he thought his government was about to be deposed, and wonder if the war can be safely brought to a close without regime change in Moscow. When we come back, what is Putin's endgame for this war? Western experts who watch Vladimir Putin very closely puzzle over how he seems to have miscalculated so badly in getting himself into the Ukraine war. Many go back to his long period of isolation in the 2 years leading up to the invasion, often appearing in public by himself, even when attending religious services, meeting other world leaders and even his own advisors at the end of long tables, because he was apparently somewhat paranoid about catching the COVID virus. He was studying Russian history and said he came to the conclusion that Ukraine was not a real country and should be part of Russia.
Поле битвы, на которое нас позвала судьба и история, это поле битвы за наш народ, за большую историческую Россию.
At various points in the last year, Vladimir Putin has suggested that Russians are just taking back what is properly theirs. He used the example of the territory seized from Sweden by Russia in the time of Peter the Great.
Вот, ну, судя по всему, на нашу долю тоже, выпало.
He laid out his theories of Russian history in a long treatise published a few months before the February invasion.
And I think this obsession with history, it's all about what you might call dictator syndrome. He was very isolated during the pandemic, really saw almost no one, and was calling out books, papers, immersed in the past, if you like. And what's interesting about Putin is that he's not really anymore in the world of geopolitics. He's in some sort of, I call it a sort of strange and unreachable realm, where he's thinking about his role in Russia's sort of great history and how he measures up to people like Ivan the Terrible or Peter the Great or even Stalin.
Longtime Putin watcher Sir Lawrence Friedman is Emeritus Professor of War Studies at the University of London.
Putin, once in a lifetime moment, and his lifetime may not be that much longer, once in a lifetime moment, to solve the Ukraine problem in a way that corrects all this historical nonsense and brings it back into the fold. At least he'd got that into his head. It seemed that he just pursued it to the point that very few people around him, other than the most immediate courtiers, really seemed to have a keen idea of what he was doing.
I mean, there's a sort of paradox at the heart of this war, this invasion and events last year, is that Putin considers himself to be a brilliant spy, and yet it appears that his domestic spy agencies had told him that Ukrainians would rise up and welcome their Russian liberators, would cheer Russian tanks, give the soldiers flowers, praise them, etc. And of course, it didn't happen like that. He thought he was just fighting a corrupt pro-Western government and the Ukrainian army. In fact, he now knows, he's discovered, to his great cost, that he's fighting an entire country of 40 million plus people.
Former U.S. National Security Advisor John Bolton has dealt with Russian leadership for many years. He says that many of Putin's advisors, like Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, actually share their president's dreams of old-style Russian imperialism, especially when it comes to Ukraine.
Lavrov, for a time, was my counterpart. And the briefing assessment I got of him then, this would be 1990 or thereabouts, was we assess that Lavrov is not a communist, we assess he is a czarist. And I would say that about all of them. They think that the United States and the West were responsible for the breakup of the Soviet Union. They think that was illegitimate. They think Ukraine is an illegitimate state, and so are the other independent republics. And they intend to do something about it. That's what they think.
Now the Ukraine battle seems to have settled into a stalemate. A war of attrition on the Eastern Front, with entrenched armies fighting over small amounts of territory. Putin has turned to relentless long-range missile attacks, especially against electricity plants and other civilian infrastructure in urban areas.
One thing he's trying to do is destroy Ukrainian civilian morale by destroying water and energy supply. Now, they're not doing it that effectively, but that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to destroy Ukrainian willingness to resist.
Why do you say it's not effective?
Because the Ukrainian willingness to resist, if anything, is probably getting stronger, not weaker, and people see this as an inevitable part of a Russian attack on their nation.
While there seems to be unanimity among Putin watchers that he has miscalculated and handled the war quite badly, there is some division of opinion about how the NATO alliance has responded to the Putin challenge.
I will give the Biden administration a lot of credit for pulling together this alliance, keeping it together. Certainly the NATO alliance, but also the broader coalition, all of the EU, all of the G7, our East Asian allies, the Japanese and the South Koreans and the Australians and the New Zealanders. It's been very effective.
Some Putin watchers are exasperated to see the NATO alliance tying itself in knots about how many Western battle tanks to provide Ukraine. And lately, the U.S. debate on whether Ukraine should receive Western fighter jets.
On NATO territory, a sacred obligation.
U.S. President Biden clearly fears cornering Putin.
Although we will not fight the Third World War in Ukraine.
So how do you think the U.S. and NATO have handled the Ukraine war?
I would describe it generally as a day late and a dollar short and lacking in an overall strategy. It's evidence that the administration is deterred by the Russian threat that the war will escalate if we do too much. As if a country defending itself against unprovoked aggression has to worry about offending the other side. That's a curious way to conduct defense of an aspiring democracy. And it's proof to the Russians that despite all the back-patting we've done about how strong NATO has been, really hasn't been strong enough.
Defenders of the NATO strategy so far say that there had to be a gradual approach to keep the alliance united, which became much easier only after the Ukrainians showed the world that they were capable of fighting in the early stages of the war.
Once Kiev became defensible, and once the Russian attempts to invade Kiev failed, then I think that was a very good reason for more reluctant allies like the French and the Germans to actually get stuck in much more behind the Ukrainians. We know that the Canadians are very supportive, we know that the Americans were, we know that the Brits were as well, but we needed more than that. You need European Union nations as well to get much more engaged and much more involved.
Now, with the one-year anniversary of the invasion behind us, the debate turns to possible endgames. While Ukrainian President Zelensky has said the war cannot stop until Ukraine regains all of its territory, U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken has speculated that there could be a ceasefire along the battle lines that were in existence before Putin invaded last February 24th, when the Russians held only parts of the Ukrainian Donbass region and Crimea. U.S. General Mark Milley was the first to suggest that maybe the Zelensky government should go into peace talks because he thought it unlikely the Russian army could be defeated in Ukraine. He is not alone.
I find it very difficult to imagine the Ukrainians just chasing the Russians out. I don't think it's going to work like that.
The Ukrainians will have to agree a set of peace deals, or what victory looks like, with its Western allies. That is probably something along the 24th of February borders. The problem is that is not sellable for the Russians. Putin can't sell that, so Putin will have to continue the war. And we know that the one thing Putin does pretty much all the time is escalate, unless he is defeated in battle.
A particular sticking point in the endgame discussion will be the status of Ukraine's southern peninsula of Crimea. Russia seized that territory without a fight in 2014. And Putin has made his Crimean conquest a central element of his legacy. Many believe it will be impossible to ever get him to give it up. Will the Ukrainians be flexible about that?
most Ukrainians are quite aware that there could come a point, Crimea is an obvious point, where to take the war that next stage may be too much.
And I believe that the Ukrainians are justified when they say they'll push the Russians out of all of their territory, including Donbass, but that there may be some part of that Ukrainian territory, i.e. that is Crimea, that might have to be in negotiations, might have to be returned diplomatically. They would be in a position to say, okay, now we're willing to talk to you, the Russians, about when we can take back Crimea. They will never give it up, but they might be willing to have a conversation about it, might be willing to say, okay, 10 years.
Putin has to be shown that the military position in Ukraine is untenable, and hopefully at some point, if that can be done, then things will move in Moscow, and we may find a way out of this war. But realism seems to me in this situation to point out that Putin so far has shown himself scared stiff of acknowledging defeat because he doesn't want the reckoning. So he'll carry on as long as he can.
Perhaps the greatest miscalculation made by Putin and his generals was to underestimate the reaction to his invasion by the Western powers in the NATO alliance, and the massive flow of weapons and money that has flooded into Ukraine to sustain the battle against the Russian army.
Putin always thinks that the other guy will blink. In other words, you make enough threats, you use force, you lie, you dissemble, and the West will always flake. Canadians will flake, the Americans will flake, the Brits will flake. They'll be very unhappy, but eventually they'll make concessions, and Russia will prevail. But I actually think that this war really is probably the greatest strategic blunder of his time in office, and it may well be the one that sooner or possibly later throws him from power.
Luke Harding is in some ways haunted by the faces of the Ukrainians he met over his months covering the invasion and its aftermath, many of whom are now dead, and says he wanted to write his book to make Western readers appreciate the magnitude of what is at stake in this war.
To remind people, to remind Canadians and others that actually it's just fate that they're not Ukrainians, that Ukrainians are just like us, and that we view the news headlines. We see real people there, that we think about the Ukraine war with kindness and with empathy, and that we support Ukraine. Because actually it's their struggle, but it's also our struggle.
Все, будьте здорові. Спасибо.